Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. The rain continued to pour down as Mark walked slowly back to his small apartment. He was lost in thought, his mind racing with questions about the proposal Eleanor had made. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting long shadows as he made his way down the quiet street. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back to reality. It was a message from his mother. "Have you thought about it, Mark? We really need this." Mark sighed deeply as he read the message, the weight of his family's financial troubles pressing down on him even more. He knew that agreeing to Eleanor's offer would change everything, his life, his dignity, and his future. But what choice did he have? The debts were piling up, and his mother's health was deteriorating. He needed a way out. And Eleanor, for all her coldness, was offering him a way out, a chance to breathe again. Later that evening, Mark found himself back at Brooks Bistro. The warmth from inside the cafe contrasted sharply with the chilly night outside. He stepped in, shaking the rain from his jacket, and made his way to the back where Eleanor was already seated, waiting. She looked as composed and elegant as ever, her eyes meeting his as he sat down across from her. The following morning, Mark woke up early, his mind still racing with the events from the night before. He hadn't expected to feel so conflicted about the decision. He had signed the contract, but now it felt like he had stepped into a world that wasn't his own. The thought of his family's future, however, kept him grounded. He had made a promise, and he had to stick to it. As Mark prepared for the first official event as Eleanor's husband, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The suit he had been provided fit perfectly, but the weight of it felt too heavy. It wasn't just the fabric or the fit, it was the role he was about to play, a role that didn't feel like his own. He stared at himself in the mirror, adjusting the tie that Eleanor's assistant had handed him. He looked like someone else, someone more important, more polished. When he arrived at the event, a high-profile gala at a luxurious hotel, Mark felt like an outsider. The glittering chandeliers, the elegantly dressed people, and the air of sophistication that surrounded him were all so different from the world he had come from. But there he was, standing next to Eleanor, who moved through the crowd with grace and confidence. She looked every bit the part of the powerful woman she was, a woman who didn't need anything or anyone, and yet here he was, playing the role of her husband. "Mark," Eleanor said, her voice cool and businesslike, "remember, this is all about appearances. Smile, shake hands, and keep your distance. This is about us showing the world what they expect to see, nothing more." He nodded, but the coldness in her voice sent a chill down his spine. She had made it clear from the start that this was a business arrangement, but as he stood there beside her, something about the way she looked at him seemed different. There was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, something almost human, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. Mark was introduced to a few of Eleanor's high-profile friends. He offered polite smiles and exchanged pleasantries, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. He wasn't used to this world, and it felt like everyone knew it. He was just a pawn in Eleanor's game, and he couldn't help but wonder why had she chosen him. What did she see in him, other than someone desperate enough to sign the contract? As the evening went on, Mark found himself more and more disconnected from the world around him. Eleanor seemed to blend seamlessly into the crowd, her laughter light and easy, while he felt every moment of his presence at the event. He couldn't ignore the whispers and glances that followed them wherever they went. It was clear that people were curious about their arrangement, but no one dared to ask directly. It wasn't until the end of the night, when the event was winding down, that Mark caught a glimpse of something unexpected. As he was walking to the exit, Eleanor's hand brushed his. For a brief moment, he felt a warmth in her touch, an almost imperceptible softness that had been absent throughout the night. It was so subtle that he wasn't sure if he had imagined it, but for a moment, he saw her in a different light, just a woman, not the cold CEO who had orchestrated everything. As they left the event, Eleanor said nothing. They drove back to her mansion in silence, the car's headlights slicing through the darkness. Mark sat next to her, his mind whirling with questions, but he didn't dare speak them aloud. He wasn't sure he was ready to confront whatever this was between them, or even if he wanted to. When they arrived at the mansion, Mark followed Eleanor inside. The house was as grand as he had imagined, filled with expensive art and luxurious furnishings. But as he stood in the grand hallway, surrounded by the echoes of silence, he felt more alone than ever. Eleanor led him to the guest room where he would be staying, and with a curt nod, she closed the door behind her. Mark stood there for a moment, staring at the opulent room. It was beautiful, everything he had never dreamed of, but it felt empty. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't this coldness, this emptiness, this feeling that no matter what he did, he was still a stranger in this world. As he lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he realized. Eleanor wasn't just a businesswoman. She wasn't just a powerful CEO. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something he had yet to uncover. But for now, he had no choice but to play along, to act the part of the husband in this strange, detached arrangement. Tomorrow, he would face the world again, standing by her side, pretending to be her husband. But deep down, Mark knew that something had shifted, and whether he liked it or not, his life would never be the same. The days that followed were a blur for Mark. His life had shifted overnight, and he found himself spending more time in Eleanor's mansion, attending high-profile events and playing the role of a husband he had never imagined. Each morning, he woke up in a luxurious guest room, the soft linens and plush furnishings feeling like a far cry from his modest apartment. But as he looked out of the window at the sprawling estate, the nagging feeling of being an outsider never left him. Despite his growing discomfort, Mark continued to play his part. Eleanor had made it clear that this was a business arrangement, but as time passed, he couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in their dynamic. At first, Eleanor remained distant, treating him as nothing more than a prop in her carefully crafted world. But there were moments, small moments, when she would drop her guard. The brief touches, the softer tone in her voice, and the way her eyes lingered on him for just a second too long. One evening, as they attended a charity auction, Mark felt the weight of their charade more than ever. Eleanor was the picture of grace and elegance, chatting with influential people, while Mark stood by her side, trying to blend in. It was a glamorous affair, with crystal glasses and expensive perfume filling the air. Mark felt like he was playing dress-up in someone else's life. "Mark," Eleanor whispered as they made their way through the crowd. "Remember, keep your distance. Smile. Act like you belong here." He nodded, but as he glanced around at the wealthy guests, he couldn't help but feel like a fraud. His suit, tailored to perfection, felt like a costume. He wasn't one of them, and no amount of money or fancy events could change that. As the auction began, Eleanor's attention was entirely on the items being sold, but Mark found his eyes wandering to the people around them. He couldn't help but notice how they looked at Eleanor, respectful, even a little in awe. She had earned her place among them. He, on the other hand, was just another face in the crowd. He didn't belong. But then, something unexpected happened. In the midst of all the glitz and glamour, Mark found himself in a quiet moment with Eleanor. They had stepped outside onto a balcony to get some fresh air, away from the Dana, noise, and the crowds. "I'm not like them," Mark said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't belong here." Eleanor turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was a silence between them, one that felt heavier than all the unspoken words in the room. And then, for the first time since he had met her, Eleanor reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Mark looked at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. There was something in her gaze that made him question everything he thought he knew about her. Was it possible that there was more to this arrangement than he realized? He couldn't deny that, despite the coldness of their agreement, there was a strange connection between them. For the first time, Mark wondered if he was starting to see Eleanor as more than just the powerful woman who had paid off his debts. Was there more to her than the CEO facade? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain: his feelings were becoming more complicated than he had ever anticipated. The night went on, and Mark found himself caught between two worlds. He was supposed to be Eleanor's husband, but in that moment, standing on the balcony with her, he felt a strange mix of confusion and curiosity. What was he doing here? Was this just a business deal, or had it become something more? As the evening came to an end, they made their way back to the mansion. The silence between them was more comfortable now, but Mark still couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. He wasn't just playing a role anymore, he was starting to feel like part of her world. When they arrived back at the mansion, Eleanor turned to him before heading inside. "Thank you for tonight," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "You did well." Mark smiled faintly, though his mind was elsewhere. "I'm just doing my part," he replied, his words feeling hollow even as he said them. But deep down, Mark knew that his part was becoming harder to play. The lines between business and something more were starting to blur, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending. As he walked to his room that night, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Had he made a mistake by signing that contract? Or had he simply opened the door to something he wasn't ready for? Whatever it was, he knew one thing for sure: his life was no longer his own. The following week, Mark found himself becoming more and more entangled in the world of high society that Eleanor inhabited. He had been to several more events, all of them glamorous, all of them filled with the kind of people who had more wealth than Mark could even fathom. And through it all, he remained by her side, playing the part of the dutiful husband, smiling for the cameras, and shaking hands with influential people. But inside, he was slowly starting to crack. One evening, after another extravagant gala, Mark found himself alone in the mansion. Eleanor had stayed behind to attend a private meeting with a business associate, leaving him to wander the halls of the massive house. As he walked through the grand foyer, he couldn't help but feel more isolated than ever. The house, despite its beauty and luxury, felt cold and empty. He didn't belong here. He hadn't belonged anywhere in a long time. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard a voice call his name. He turned to find Eleanor standing at the top of the staircase, looking down at him. Her expression was unreadable, as always, but there was something different in the way she looked at him that night. It wasn't just business anymore. Mark couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt it. There was something more, something he couldn't ignore. "Mark," she said softly, her voice carrying down to him, "I need to talk to you." He walked toward her, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, she didn't move, but she gestured for him to come closer. "What's going on, Eleanor?" Mark asked, his voice cautious. He was still playing the part, still acting as though everything was fine, but his nerves were beginning to get the best of him. He couldn't keep up this act forever. Eleanor paused for a moment, then sighed deeply. "I've been thinking. I know this arrangement is unconventional, but I can't help but feel like we're starting to blur the lines between what's real and what's not. I don't want to keep pretending, Mark." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Was she finally going to end this charade? Was she about to tell him that the contract, the marriage, everything was just business and nothing more? He braced himself. But Eleanor's next words surprised him. Mark swallowed, his pulse racing. "Eleanor, what are you saying?" She took a step toward him, her eyes softening for the first time since he had met her. "I don't want us to keep pretending, Mark. I want this to be real. I know it's complicated, and I know you didn't sign up for this, but I can't ignore what's happening between us." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had known something had changed between them, but hearing her say it out loud made it all too real. He had spent the last few weeks trying to convince himself that this was just a business deal, that it was just for show. But now, he wasn't so sure. Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze locked on his. "I'm not asking you to love me, Mark, but I'm asking for more than just an arrangement. I want us to have something real, even if it's messy, even if it's complicated." For the first time, Mark found himself questioning everything. Was he ready for this? Was he ready to let go of the contract and embrace whatever it was that was forming between them? He didn't know the answer, but what he did know was that things were no longer simple. Eleanor wasn't just the powerful CEO he had signed a deal with. She was someone he was starting to care about. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Eleanor placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. "I don't want you to make any decisions now," she said gently. "I just needed you to know where I stand, and I needed you to know that I see you, not just as a business partner, not just as a husband for hire. I see you." Mark stood there, his mind spinning. What was he supposed to do with this new information? What was he supposed to do with the feelings that were beginning to stir inside him? Eleanor had crossed a line he hadn't expected, and now he wasn't sure how to navigate the path ahead. "I need some time to think," Mark said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Eleanor nodded, her expression softening. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Mark turned and walked away, his mind racing. He had been so sure of himself just days ago, convinced that this arrangement was just a way to get by. But now, he wasn't so sure anymore. He had thought he was in control of the situation, but it was becoming clear that Eleanor was not only controlling the terms of their contract, but also the direction of his heart. As Mark lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he wondered what would happen next. He had entered this deal to escape the crushing weight of his debts, but now he was faced with a different kind of weight, the kind that came with real emotions, real connections, and a future he hadn't expected. One thing was certain: Mark's life had changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend, and whatever path he chose, it would never be the same. The next few days passed in a haze for Mark. After Eleanor's confession, everything seemed different. He found himself constantly questioning what he was feeling, what she was feeling, and whether or not he could still keep his distance. The line between business and personal was becoming harder to define, and, with every moment, it seemed to blur more and more. Eleanor was no longer just the woman he had signed a contract with. She was someone he was starting to care about, someone who had stepped into his life in a way he hadn't expected. Mark woke up early the following Saturday morning, the sound of rain softly tapping against his window. He had been unable to sleep, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubts and emotions. As he lay in bed, he remembered Eleanor's words, the soft vulnerability in her voice that night. "I see you." Those words echoed in his mind. She had shown him a side of herself he hadn't seen before, and it left him unsettled. Was this really just an arrangement, or was something more unfolding between them? Later that afternoon, he was sitting in the living room of Eleanor's mansion, flipping through a book he wasn't really reading. The silence of the house seemed to weigh on him. He was so used to the quiet now, but it wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that only came from being surrounded by luxury yet still feeling lonely. He felt as though he had everything he could want materially, but emotionally he was adrift. His thoughts were interrupted when Eleanor walked in. She looked as stunning as ever, her hair perfectly styled, her posture poised. But there was a different energy in her today, one that made Mark feel more vulnerable than ever. "Mark," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "I know you're still processing everything I said the other night, but I want to be clear about something. I'm not expecting anything from you. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, and I'm not asking for a fairy tale. I just want us to be real with each other." Mark looked up at her, his heart racing. She had made it clear that she wasn't asking for romance, but hearing it again felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't sure what to make of it yet, but it gave him the space he needed to think, to figure out where he stood. "I'm not sure what to say, Eleanor," Mark admitted, his voice low. "I didn't expect any of this. I thought this was just a business deal, but now I'm not so sure." Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes steady. "I understand. This wasn't part of the plan. But sometimes life doesn't follow the plan, and I don't want to keep pretending that everything's just about the contract." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I care about you, Mark. I don't know what this is, but I don't want to ignore it anymore." Mark felt a knot form in his chest. He wasn't ready to admit it, but he cared about her too. Not just because of the arrangement, but because of the person she was when she let her guard down. The Eleanor he had come to know wasn't the ice-cold CEO. She was more than that, and it scared him. He swallowed hard. "Eleanor, Before he could finish, she raised a hand to stop him. "Don't say anything right now. Just think about it." Mark nodded, his mind still swirling with everything she had just said. He had to admit he had never expected to feel this way. He had entered this arrangement with the sole purpose of fixing his financial situation. He had promised himself that he wouldn't get emotionally involved. But here he was, standing on the edge of something he didn't fully understand. The following days felt like a blur. Eleanor and Mark continued their routine, attending more events and playing the roles they had been cast into. But now, there was an unspoken tension between them, something neither of them was sure how to navigate. At night, as they sat in the quiet of the mansion, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. He was no longer just pretending to be her husband. He was starting to feel like he actually was. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and events, they found themselves alone in the living room again. Eleanor was sitting on the sofa, her posture as elegant as ever, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mark," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking about everything. About what you said, about what I said. I think we both know this arrangement can't go on forever. We need to figure out what we really want." Mark took a deep breath. "I agree, but I don't know what I want. I don't know what this is, Eleanor. I don't know if it's even possible to turn a business deal into something more." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her gaze intense but kind. "I don't have the answers either, but I know I don't want to lose what we have. Whatever this is, I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for the chance to figure it out, together." Mark felt his heart race. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that for the first time in a long while, he wanted to try. Try to make sense of the mess they were in. Try to see where it could lead. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear: he was no longer in control of his own heart. "Okay," he said softly, his voice filled with resolve. "Let's figure this out, together." And with that, the tension that had been building between them finally began to ease. It wasn't a promise of anything grand or perfect, but it was a step forward, a step toward something real. The next few days were filled with a quiet tension. Mark and Eleanor had agreed to try to figure things out, but the reality of what that meant was still unclear. They continued to attend events, interact with high society figures, and go through the motions of their agreement. But something had shifted. Mark couldn't help but notice the small changes in their interactions. Eleanor was more present, more engaged, and there were moments when he saw a vulnerability in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was late one night when the next shift happened. Mark had returned home after another gala, exhausted but still buzzing from the night. As he walked through the grand entrance of Eleanor's mansion, he found her sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in hand. The soft light from the chandelier cast a warm glow across her face, and for a moment, she looked so much like the woman he had signed up to be with. But now, there was a softness in her expression that made her seem more human. "Mark," Eleanor said as he entered, her voice quiet, "I've been thinking a lot lately, about us." Mark stopped in his tracks, unsure of how to respond. "I've been thinking about us too." She smiled faintly and patted the seat next to her. "Come sit with me." Mark did as she asked, sitting down beside her on the plush sofa. The silence stretched between them for a moment, each of them unsure of how to begin this conversation that had been hanging over them for days. Eleanor took a deep breath, placing her wine glass down on the coffee table. "I know we've been playing the part, pretending like everything is fine, but I don't want to pretend anymore, Mark. I don't want this just to be some business deal anymore." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had known this was coming, but hearing her say it out loud made the weight of it feel even heavier. "Eleanor, what are you saying?" She turned to him, her gaze steady but full of emotion. "I'm saying I want more. I know we've been through a lot this arrangement, the public appearances, the charade. But I can't keep going like this. I care about you, Mark. I don't want to lose you just because of a contract. I want us to be real, whatever that means." Mark swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. This wasn't what he had expected when he first entered the agreement. At first, he had only been focused on getting out of debt and taking care of his family. But now, he found himself in the midst of something far more complicated. He had feelings for her, feelings he had tried to ignore for weeks. But now, hearing her say this, he couldn't deny them any longer. "Eleanor, He didn't know what to say. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but the one thing that kept coming to the surface was how much he had started to care for her. She reached out, placing her hand on his. "You don't have to say anything. I just need you to know where I stand. I can't keep pretending like this is just a business arrangement anymore. I'm not asking for perfection, Mark. I'm not even asking for love. But I want something real with you. Whatever that might look like." Mark stared at her hand on his, feeling the warmth of her touch. He had always been cautious, always guarded, but in that moment, he knew that he was no longer sure of where the line between duty and desire lay. He had been keeping his distance, afraid of what would happen if he allowed himself to care too much. But now, he wasn't so sure that holding back was the right thing to do. He looked up at her, his voice low but steady. "I think I want that too, Eleanor. I think I've wanted it all along." Her eyes softened, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "Then let's not keep pretending." For the first time since he had agreed to this arrangement, Mark felt like he was stepping into something real. It wasn't going to be easy. There would still be doubts, complications, and the ever-present question of whether this was the right thing for them both. But in that moment, with Eleanor's hand in his and the quiet of the mansion around them, he felt a glimmer of hope. As they sat there together, Mark knew that this was a turning point for them both. They had crossed a line, one they couldn't uncross, and no matter where it led, it would be a journey they would take together. The days following their conversation were filled with a new kind of energy between Mark and Eleanor. It wasn't quite love, but there was something undeniably real about their connection now. The tension that had hung over them for weeks seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of mutual understanding and respect. For the first time, Mark felt like he wasn't just playing a role. Eleanor's sincerity had broken through the walls he had carefully built around himself. They continued to attend events together, but now there was a different dynamic. Eleanor was no longer just the powerful CEO in control of everything. She was a woman, vulnerable and honest in ways she hadn't been before. And Mark, despite his initial hesitation, was slowly becoming part of her world, not just as her husband for show, but as someone who mattered to her. One evening, After a particularly long day, Eleanor suggested they take a break from their usual routine and spend some time away from the crowds and expectations. Mark agreed, though he was still unsure of what this would mean for them. They decided to take a weekend trip to a quiet cabin in the mountains, away from the luxury of the mansion and the pressures of high society. The drive was long, but the quiet gave Mark the space he needed to think. Eleanor was sitting beside him, her eyes focused on the road ahead, her usual composure still in place. They didn't speak much during the journey, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. This trip wasn't just about escaping the world. It was about stepping into something new together, something neither of them had fully understood until now. When they arrived at the cabin, Mark was struck by the simplicity of it. The wooden beams, the crackling fireplace, and the smell of pine in the air made him feel like he could breathe again. It was nothing like the grandeur of the mansion, and yet it felt more like home than anything he had experienced in weeks. As they settled in, Eleanor opened a bottle of wine, and they sat by the fire, the quiet crackle of the logs filling the space between them. Mark took a sip of the wine, feeling the warmth spread through him as the cool night air surrounded the cabin. For the first time, he felt at peace. "I didn't think you'd ever agree to a trip like this," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer than usual, as if she was allowing herself to be more vulnerable. Mark smiled, the weight of his usual worries momentarily lifted. "I didn't think I would either, but I guess there's a lot about this situation that's surprising me." Eleanor chuckled, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. "I think that's the point, isn't it? Life's full of surprises. I never imagined I'd be here either." Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. He had always seen Eleanor as a woman of control, of precision. But now, sitting here with her in this quiet cabin, he saw a different side of her. She was just like him, someone who had been trying to figure out what came next. Someone who was looking for more, just as he was. "I guess we're both trying to figure out what this is," Mark said, his voice quiet. He turned to her, meeting her gaze. "But for the first time, I don't feel like I'm just pretending anymore. I feel like this is real. Whatever this is between us." Eleanor smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Mark's heart race. "I think I feel the same way. I'm not sure what happens next, but I'm willing to find out with you." Mark nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about a contract anymore. This wasn't just about the money or the status. It was about them, about the possibility of something real between two people who had been thrown together by circumstances, but who now saw each other in a different light. As the fire flickered and the night grew deeper, Mark realized that this trip, this quiet moment with Eleanor, was the beginning of something new. They were no longer just playing the part. They were beginning to understand each other in ways that went beyond the surface. And whatever came next, Mark was ready to face it together with her. "So, what do we do now?" Mark asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and hope. Eleanor looked at him, her expression thoughtful, before she answered, "We take it one step at a time. We figure out what we want, and then we go for it." Mark smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle in his chest. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking it with someone who truly understood him. And that, he realized, was all he needed. The weekend at the cabin marked a turning point for Mark and Eleanor. They had spent the days in peaceful solitude, away from the expectations of the world, and something shifted in the space between them. The walls they had both built, Mark's from years of trying to protect himself and Eleanor's from a lifetime of relying on control, seemed to crumble. In the quiet of the mountains, they had begun to understand each other in ways they hadn't expected. It wasn't love yet, but it was something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of a real connection. As they returned to the city, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that everything was different. The mansion, the wealth, the luxury, it all felt less important now. What mattered more was what had happened between them during those few days away. He realized that he didn't need the grand gestures or the status to feel fulfilled. It wasn't about playing a role anymore. It was about being present with each other. When they returned to their busy lives, Eleanor didn't press Mark for answers. She gave him the space he needed, and he appreciated it. They went back to their routine, but there was an understanding between them now. They didn't need to define everything immediately. They were taking things one step at a time. One evening, a few weeks after their trip, Eleanor invited Mark to another gala, this time a more intimate affair with a smaller group of people. It was the first time they had gone to such an event since their trip, and Mark could feel the difference in the air. He wasn't just by her side as a husband for show anymore. He was there because he wanted to be. As they entered the venue, Eleanor looked at him with a small smile. "You ready?" she asked, her voice low but warm. Mark smiled back, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. "I think I am." Throughout the evening, he realized that he wasn't nervous, as he had been at their first event together. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was truly part of her world, and for the first time, it felt natural. Later, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Eleanor turned to him. "I know we've been through a lot," she said quietly, "but I want to say thank you, Mark, for being real with me, for not just going along with the deal, but for actually trying." Mark looked at her, his heart full. "Thank you too. I never expected any of this, but I'm glad it's happening." Eleanor took a step closer, her gaze softening. "You're not just my husband for show anymore, Mark. You're someone I care about, someone I want in my life, not just for the contract, but for real." Mark felt his heart skip a beat. This was what he had been waiting for, the shift from a business deal to something real, something that couldn't be measured by money or status. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor took his hand, and for the first time, Mark realized that this was just the beginning. They had come a long way from the initial agreement, and while they didn't have all the answers yet, they were no longer pretending. They were building something real, together. In the months that followed, Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate their complicated relationship, learning more about each other every day. They didn't have to be perfect, and they didn't have to have it all figured out. But they were no longer playing roles. They were just two people, figuring out what it meant to be with each other. Mark's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined when he first signed that contract. He had come to realize that the best things in life couldn't be planned or bought, they had to be lived. And with Eleanor by his side, he was ready to live that life, whatever it might bring. As they stood together on the balcony that night, overlooking the city, Mark knew that he had found something priceless, not in the wealth or the status, but in the connection they had built, one step at a time.